Chapter 3: Life is all around us. Even when imperceptible to our senses, it is still there, pervading every dimension of the existence. It is undoubtedly a peculiar occurrence. Everything we know, everything that we can see, touch, smell, and hear is a product of the differentiation of that very process. In and off its own, it is enveloped in contradictions from the very onset. It is everywhere, yet scarce. Its continuation is readily accounted for, yet its origins are still veiled. Every time one gets closer to placing the faculty within well-defined boundaries, it still appears to pass through them like sand escaping a firm grasp. It's evident, yet what lies behind its incessant proliferation escapes the scrutiny. And as the very process it entails within the domain of existence, it virtuously circumvents attempts to establish a line that clearly distinguishes the contents of the phenomenon from what it is not. Life is interesting to us, as most of the human species currently considers planet Earth the sole carrier of this peculiar faculty. In essence, and by no means faulty, it appears that life in the form it flourishes on Earth is unprecedented and oddity, with minuscule chances of emergence, yet robust enough to have survived as a materialized form of the evolutionary process. One of the peculiarities that highlight its capacity to outmaneuver attempts to map it within its domain pertains to the notion that definition and the outlook on such is bound by conventionality of the individual sensory apparatus. This naturally touches upon some of the most fundamental absurdities. However, the question of how one defines life is also a matter of assigned credence that is, in its turn, outlined by the body of attainable and attained knowledge. Thus, what appears as its most conspicuous might not be as apparent as initially conceived of. A glance towards previous chapters will surely remind one that the individual and subjective understanding is a tip of the iceberg, which pertains to the sum as a whole as much as the whole pertains to the sum. In that manner, contingency of inference is highly dependent on the mountain one is situated on, and naturally, the language that describes the coordinates. If the subjective understanding of the respective faculty is of such character that it pertains solely to the readily evident dimensions, then the capacity for breathing, absorption of nutrition, and further proliferation are the key parameters irrefutably associated with the faculty in question. In many ways, this is an easily distinguishable notion that, under the parole of common sense, is closely related to a clear understanding of the world as a domain territorialized by subjects and objects that, in their respective manner, pertain to the above-mentioned set of attributes. The animate breathes, nourishes, and proliferates, the inanimate doesn't. This is life at its most apparent and commonly accepted. However, it seems that the more one attempts to come to terms with the process itself, the more visible it becomes that life readily eschews the most evident of the interpretations. Whilst it might be easy to succumb to the temptation to assume that a quick glance is enough to understand what lies entailed in the respective faculty, a question of how resilient these assumptions are within the produced symbiosis, defined by the relationship value-meaning, remains to be investigated. As such, establishing a satisfactory definition has proved itself as a somewhat of a difficult task. At the surface level, such seems to be readily defined by the clearly distinguishable binary. Something is either animate or inanimate, or at least that is how this world appears to us. However, when it comes to placing a clearly distinguishable line, supported by evidence and language that aligns with such, most of those who have attempted have all arrived towards the recognition that the task at hand perhaps isn't as simple as one had initially conceived of. As species, mankind has come quite far on its way from the days of dancing around the fire and gazing at the stars. With the passing of time, what becomes readily evident is that the more the understanding of our own coordinates within the cosmic scope expands, the more one becomes aware of the universal entanglement that defies clear distinctions. The current resurgence of interest, mirroring a fascinating shift on the domain of global consciousness and politics, has only increased the enveloping curiosity. The question of how life formed is still one of the central themes that the contemporary body is grappling with, and has for as long as humanity can remember been one of the most myth-laden faculties within the historical account of human evolution. In essence, life within its capacity for extension through the means of more than apparent causality on a day-to-day basis is so prosaic that its peculiarities seem to escape unnoticed. And yet, every time's life is mentioned within the scope of any of its numerous prospects, it becomes evident that this mundanity is not even the icing on the cake. Some attribute life to God or godlike entities. Some attribute it to turtles or haphazard conditions that have by chance instigated a process, and some are sitting on a fence taking notes. Dissonance that emerges appears to pertain to the evident dichotomy anchored in this cyclical mundanity on one hand, and on the other our complete obliviousness to the mechanical underpinnings that are outside the grasp of our current understanding. In many ways, the origin of life stands on the same pillars as the event of the Big Bang. If one looks at evolution as a process, it is deeply intertwined with the capacity to account for the emergence of faculties that define life through means of materialized tokens. The materialization of such markers, which through the retrospective accountancy act as confirmation of causal cascade, link the events entailed in the process and point the lens towards inescapable interdependence. The ensuing cascade is readily evident, yet the very instance that has instigated such still escapes satisfactory elucidation, and at the present moment still lies veiled from the scientific and collective gaze. The aftermath of Big Bang has throughout years of scrutiny been examined to an extent which has allowed for sufficient mapping to illuminate the order of events that have come to define the materialized actuality. The same goes for the ensuing unfolding of life. However, in both cases, the very origins, their past, and the phase transition taking place prior to the culmination towards the eponymous occurrences are still a black box. It is odd to conceive that solely within the scope of the last few years, the initial parameters that define the existential questions have not only expanded exponentially, but are on the brink of being surpassed and dismantled altogether. A sudden change has washed over the planet within a relatively short amount of time, and the new world has become a fascinating one to account for. In many ways, this shift has become poignantly encapsulated by the emergence of new buzz terms that have come to define the current age. Quantum, meta, and possibly most generally encountered NFT all act as a record of the process that has within its geopolitical scope culminated in the embodied present. One glance backwards, and what becomes evident is the increased transparency in both how and why the concepts change, morph, and develop as the novelty allows for a light to shine upon the dimensions belonging to the New World Order. However, regardless of all the vicissitudes entailed in the present moment, one thing remains central: that the fascination with life, and the mysteries pertaining to its complexity that emerge the more one investigates the matter has only increased throughout time. To say that the universe is a complex system in every appointed direction doesn't suffice when it comes to accounting for the intricacies that the structure as a whole operates on. The paradox that becomes readily evident is embedded in the notion that the more human understanding of the universe expands, the more one becomes entangled with the forces and subsequent systems that underpin the dimensionalities of biological and social existence, making it difficult to come to terms with the original query. The famous proverb says that it is difficult to see the forest from trees, and naturally vice versa is equally valid. The more one goes into the weeds of the matter at hand, the more visible the convolution and complexity at its core. every structure in the universe is essentially defined by the fundamental fields of respective energy that have, through the means of achieving higher degree of structural density by the means of interaction ch, materialized into the respective state or a system. Further down the arrow of time, and the assembly and clustering of matter has marked the evolving process towards all that it is observable today. If there is something peculiar to notice about the inhabited system, it is the appearance of the dimension where incessant assembly into larger structures appears to be an act deeply embedded in the nature of the system. The earliest period that would define the formation of planets and Earth alike were pervaded by volatile conditions and temperatures so high that they surpass the entirety of the human grasp. Except from clusters of dispersed matter, nothing could survive the whirlwind of heated gas and sand. It took a while for Earth to cool down to a sufficient degree for conditions to reach a state where evolutionary processes could catch on. Not that any such task was easy at all, but the very dimension where such has transpired acts as a token of the robustness and also quantitative underpinnings of the process itself. In the same manner as the biochemical structures discovered in the laboratory act as a measure of an outcome, and as such play an important role as a record characterizing the process up to that point. A similar role is adopted by the high level of novelty structures that have spontaneously appeared out of the initial conditions. It is interesting to point out that most of the structures we are able to observe today would not have emerged if there wasn't a high level of fluctuations in the initial conditions. It appears that Mary Shelley and Frankenstein alike were on the right path when it came to conducting respective investigations on how life could have formed. Heat, pressure, and electricity seem to be the key ingredients for emergence of the countless formations that have pervaded the early days of our planet, which occurrence would be unlikely if the above-mentioned faculties didn't instigate the conditions for such to materialize. Naturally, the question that comes forth is related to the frailty of the manifested structures against such inhospitality. Emergence of life has always been considered somewhat of a delicate process, and chances for its occurrence would have been and are very slim. If one remembers that the first life forms were unicellular organisms, one will come to understand that their perseverance isn't necessarily a sign of their robustness, but perhaps indicates towards an unfathomable quantity of their formation, supported by the conditions that have pushed such towards the similar outcome, leading towards the results we are aware of today. On the other hand, the paradox surrounding robustness becomes quite apparent as the process seems to be a definition of such as it has managed to sustain itself for over 4 billions of years. Many attempts have been made to shed light on the origin of life. Again, led by the sense of causality embedded deeply within us, scientists across the globe have devoted their careers in pursuit of evidence that would shed light on the cascade of events that have instigated our existence and provide provable and reproducible results. The most prominent of theories is outlined by the suggestion that proposes RNA, a chemical polymer, as a first structure to exhibit the right capacity for evolutionary process to hook on. The question whether it is RNA or primordial, RNA a molecule preceding RNA, and somewhat smaller in size and shape, that is the main structure involved in the ignition of the process, is still somewhat unresolved. Many root for the latter due to the increased probability of survival. Due to the initial conditions, RNA, due to its bigger size, would have encountered difficulties in evading the dangers. But the process in and of its own remains unchanged in theory. Whilst there are other theories on how life could have occurred, a research conducted in 2009 and respectively in 2017 has shown that RNA molecules were most likely present during the time, some 4 billions of years ago, when it is theoreticized that life first emerged. While the formation of lipid layer and membrane will be accounted for in a different context, The main dimension that surfaces in this point in time is the one related to the ignition of inanimate matter, where a molecule defined by its structural autonomy and latency undergoes a change that instigates its replication and catalytic activity aiding such. Whilst many have turned the focus towards the question of how the molecule has developed its self-replicating and catalytic ability, it is still veiled on why such processes occurred to begin with. By examining what happens within the RNA first hypothesis, it becomes evident that nucleotides that have been assembled into a chain have, due to nature of the underlying processes, developed a capacity towards binding to the respectively reciprocal nucleotides, and as such formed new chains that would emancipate as autonomous structures. Through such means, the newly established structure would acquire a form of the mirror image of the one that has aided in its emergence, and will in turn have the same capacity to create structurally mirroring chains. This is the instance at which the initial peculiarity seems to reveal itself, a process that, through the means of pure quantitative informational processing, as defined by the created bonds, starts creating copies of itself. The second peculiarity emerges when these RNA strands are placed in the conditions under which they form complex, coiled forms and shapes by the means of the strand achieving stability through binding to its own respective parts. However, not all parts of the initial strand enter into the bonded structure, and the loose single parts, if exposed to the environment, retain their capacity of binding external nucleotides. In such manner, larger assemblies emerge and create templates that will aid in further development towards the establishment of the first system, pertaining to the clear faculty of aliveness, the unicellular organisms that have pervaded the Earth some 3 billion years ago. The third peculiarity emerges as the RNA starts proliferating not solely through the means of binding free-floating nucleotides, but that it starts interacting with foreign structures in order to create new nucleotide pairs, and as such sustain its own structural proliferation. The question that comes about is not only how does this emerge, but why does this emerge? If one glances back to the respective branches currently being accounted for, the question of how is the one that is concerned with clearly manifested markers that can be confirmed in the shared actuality. However, if one knows that the pinnacle of evolutionary process is the human species, which proliferates and excels through the navigational capacities bestowed upon it through the understanding of meaning, the question why this occurs seems to be an equally fundamental one. By looking at the RNA, which by the means of operational faculty starts fabricating components needed for its own sustenance, the question with far outreaching implications start to emerge. In essence, this process is in itself no different from the behavior that human species exhibits and engages in. What differentiates the two is the level of complexity and emergent amount of novelty tied to the respective processes. It is interesting to note that the process as a whole has facilitated for emergence of a molecule that within its physiochemical structure, and even under or perhaps due to the inhospitable conditions, is defined by a state where it adopts a self-induced circulatory ability. Abiogenesis isn't a well-understood process. We are familiar with the entry values in inanimate matter and know and are the product of the outcome, yet what happens in the middle is still outside of the scope of scientific understanding. If one thing is certain, it is that RNA holds a special place within the formation of structural novelty dominating the early Earth. If one looks at the most of the particles dominating the planet during the time life was conceived, one can say that their structural stability and autonomy is also reflective in their latency. Going back to the domain where matter has emerged as increased density of the fundamental fields, arranged in a particular matter, and continue towards assembly of particles into increasingly larger structures, what becomes evident is that the autonomy of a molecule is tightly connected to the strength of the intrinsic bonds that have come to define its underlying structure and are inherent to the structural identity. In that manner, it becomes apparent that the stronger such bonds are, the less reactive molecules are provided stable circumstances, temperature, pressure, etc. One can call this a form of latency that underpins the structure and its behavior, as the levels of reactivity with the outer surroundings are low. On the other hand, RNA, regardless of maintaining their structural capacity to a certain degree, RNAs increase and decrease in length due to specific parameters are defined by their active state, which ushers further its own proliferation. RNA's capacity for such endeavors has up to a certain point been limited to the free nucleotides in its surroundings, limiting its active scope. However, instigation of active procreation and replication has not stopped at its initial form, but from a certain point starts developing towards an increasing capacity for further development. This is where the catalytic ability of RNA steps forward at some point during abiogenesis. RNA isn't solely limited by the availability in its external environment, but started evolving towards a future capacity for free nucleotides by means of catalysis of suitable molecules. As such, the structure shifts from an inactive state entailed in the framework that has governed its predecessors, to somewhere down the line acquiring an ability for participation in and through an active recognition of its own predispositions. Of course, this is where things start escalating exponentially towards mind-bending complexity. The question that stands central for further generations to attempt to unpack is, why does a structure develop predispositions that activate the internal process on such a level as to usher replication through means of doubling? Even less is clear how recognition of external structures with the potential for being broken down to nucleotides came about. If one thinks about RNA as the first structure to have undergone phase transition, the notion to have developed capability to undergo adaptive evolution doesn't appear to be entailed in the original features of emerging matter. However, a good question to ask is whether such truly the case. It is interesting to note that what one would today deem as inanimate may also be translated into the faculty of passivity within the scope of informational integration and exchange, where no recognition of the self as locus emerges through any form of qualitative assessment, and as such the levels of activity that structures engages in are relatively low compared to the living organisms. What is entailed within the above is that most of the matter within the universe is confined to their structural properties and states with low possibility of self-induced alteration or development. As such, inanimate doesn't appear to change on its own accord through the processes entailed within the inherent architectural scope. Standing in contrast is life at its most evident, which in all its greatness is defined by incessant and perpetual cyclical exchange that governs the structure, and with increasing levels of complexity, behavior of animate matter. In many ways, this can seem like a good foundation when it comes to attempting to outline what life inherently is as it appears to us. Naturally, there is no need to go further than the internet in order to find a suitable definition of the matter at hand. A widely acclaimed proposition pertaining to the phenomenon in question is coined by NASA with the contribution by Carl Sagan, respectively placing life within the framework of being a self-sustained chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. Given the complexity of the matter, the proposed definition neatly encapsulates the domain territorialized by the respective faculty, as it establishes a clear relationship between the elements within their translatory role, and subsequently connects the matter to the intermediary parameters that have come to define it. In contrast to the phenomenon of consciousness, the concept of life isn't readily outlined by the respective synonyms, but it pertains to an assigned description that acts as an umbrella where the parameters and the underlying implications are the ones that truly identify the heart of the matter. However, the definition above doesn't solely pertain to the starting point of the evolutionary process, but more importantly acts as a threshold where it becomes self. If one looks at the entire scope of the evolutionary process, one can observe its evolving nivelations within the scope of underlying faculties that inform the process. Whilst the process exists within its own looping circularity, its most prominent feature is the one of clearly established linearity, incessantly escalating diversity, and the complexity of the materialized tokens. What becomes apparent is that progress along the arrow of time is tightly followed by an advancement of cognizing power, one's understanding of subjectivity and individuality. The question of what self is will in a strict sense connect to the narrative of the material kind, where the faculty of such pertains to an entity or a structure whose existence can be affirmed by the agent in question and acknowledged by other agents within the shared actuality. If one starts with the notion of the self, it is only natural to start with one's own structural capacity when looking for a definition. The most evident dimension of selfhood is the vessel, the hood it is contained in. Its existence is tangible and palpable, clearly distinguished by form and a barrier that separates it from the other. This self that is alive can affirm its existence, first and foremost through the means of tracing its own structural boundary, through means of sensing that acts as the threshold of the properties contained within it. To come to the understanding of what self is, one does so through the means of the sensory apparatus that has come to define the experiential content, and that acts as the first instance of relational capacity of the agent to its own existence. In essence, everything that has come to define that which self is has been done within the relational character, pertaining to the knowledge content contained within the carrier vessel. Every experience is measured against the perception, as interpreted through the means of the agent that is subjected to such as it comes to recognize these within the scope of the content available to it. However, an interesting division comes forth quite early in the process of accountancy, as the recognition of such is highly contingent upon the locus of origin. Through means of coming to terms with one's own selfhood, one comes very quickly to recognize that its internal experience is governed by two-dimensional fold, one where that which is experienced is done so against its externality, namely everything that is on the outside of the material barrier that pertains to and excites the respective thresholds, and the other that is simultaneously more evident and more obscure as it pertains to the accountancy of the inner experience that defines the content. What surfaces from the above is that which pertains to an affirmative experience of the self is tightly connected to a physical vessel that clearly separates the inner and the outer, and an apparatus that allows for an experience to be mediated as such. The question that arises is whether the initial RNA structures are within the capacity to discern this set of tasks, and as such differentiate their existence within the scope of autonomy. In essence, this would be somewhat difficult to initially accept, as the notion of what pertains to the concept of the self as such is intrinsically connected to the human cognizance of what is entailed within such a notion. Many would argue that it is impossible to have the recognition of this particular property without a cognitive apparatus, such as the one bestowed upon the animal and mammalian world, and many more would be highly reluctant to extend the recognition of selfhood past the respective species. However, the matter at hand is not simply the one of how one places credence in the light of common sense, but equally the one pertaining to the proof of such. Whilst it may seem as somewhat odd, evolution appears to us as an act of becoming, and whilst the end of the horizon is far outside our apprehension, such observation sheds light on the matter defined by phase transition. Such can jokingly be called Schrödinger's state, where the respective precursors to the faculty of life belong to neither of the realms and to both of them simultaneously. If one looks at the behavior exhibited by evolving RNA, what becomes apparent is the transition where the structure displays clear signs of self-recognizing and even goal-directed behavior, where such is clearly mirrored through the means of pairing and creating free nucleotides, alongside the act of replication. If one is to pinpoint with some level of accuracy a threshold for occurring transition, this might seem like an appropriate place. In many ways, it is this occurrence that most apparently starts pertaining to NASA's definition of life. As RNA, whilst far removed from being entailed, in the definition, begins exhibiting recognizable tendencies towards the transition in question. If one could define phase transition, its domain of existence is territorialized by properties of the binaries it spans in between. It acts as a dimension that is defined by the succession across the temporal linearity, where something recedes and something advances. In many ways, the space that is defined by such properties is also the most intricate one, as outside the scope of a clearly defined start and end point, the place of in-between is most abundant in information within the scope of tracing. The inception of life quite apparently belongs to such a realm. If one looks at the structural capacity of the inanimate faculties, one might speculate whether the inherent autonomy of structures that have come to territorialize the universe, defined by the characteristic chemical and physical properties, is in its own way a precursor to the notion of self. Why RNA transcends its initial confinement that defines the inanimate matter, and why it starts exhibiting regulatory, governing, and even self-enhancing behavior is still a matter unknown to us. In many ways, it is interesting attempting to account for the process from the standing point of knowing the outcome, which we, a highly and increasingly effective being, are the pinnacle of. Thus, the question becomes whether one can, through the means of accounting for the existing definitions of life, establish a form of retroactive tracing that allows for further unpacking through means of linguistic inquiry. If we know that the process is defined by the transition from objecthood to subjecthood, where the phase transition demarcates the space where the structures move from passive to an active state with the developing capacity for self-regulation, the question that emerges is whether one can employ language in order to retrospectively illuminate the potential implications. Language is a fickle mistress. It can illuminate and establish. It can deceive and let one run in circles without mercy. A good example of such is that one can say that human beings are the product of a life within the scope of the evolutionary process. However, the same can be said of chairs, balloons, and a light switch. Both statements are equally true, yet the implied content can be very misleading, as the two propositions carry within an entirely different set of information and mean very different things. Going back to the definition of the faculty of life, a good approach towards further investigation is to attempt to outline the singularities that have outlined its contents and observe how such pertains to the actuality at hand. In many ways, this is a matter of illuminating the domain through the available means. Words carry within them an entire narrative that, as we have seen above, can, by few simple permutations, encompass dimensions that surpass evident simplicity. Thus, in order to be able to examine the workings of the mechanisms that underpin the matter at hand, it makes sense to account for the very attributes that have shown themselves to be common denominators amongst the structures pertaining to the faculty being investigated. If one starts with the notion of the self, the question that naturally comes forth is, how does one define self? In many ways, such inquiry falls into a similar category as the one pertaining to the faculty of consciousness mentioned in previous chapters. The respective notion can be accounted for through instances that surface through the means of sensory and cognitive apparatus, available to one's own discernment. If one proceeds through means of pure inference at its most apparent, acknowledgement of one's own existence occurs through the validation of the subjective internal and external experiences, alongside the ability to actively monitor and modulate such. Likewise, one pertains to the self through means of being able to distinguish such from the non-self, where the emergence of the boundary is closely related to a set of parameters that allow one to make such inference. Quite evidently, not all systems are created equal. A blade of grass or a tree is at a different capacity to account for the self than a cognizing being whose levels of identification have long since become superior to its surroundings. However, the fundamental notion of how one pertains to the respective faculty is still bound by the recognition of the structural integrity and the tasks that have come to define it. The complexity at hand becomes evident with the understanding that the effort of establishing the faculty of self is involved in an entire set of new operations that immediately throw one into the saddle of a horse spinning at a bizarre pace on a merry-go-round. In all possible instances, the self is defined through means of the circulatory process that establishes the concept within the framework of capacities, acting as a tool within the prospects of illumination of the entity that instigates such. Through such means, it is almost impossible to distinguish self from the behavior that one engages in, as all endeavors closely pertain to defining the notion they belong to, thus simultaneously entering into and defining the outlined content. In that manner, it appears impossible to define self without involving an entire array of concepts that in their respective turn act as synonyms, whilst illuminating the very recognition of the centralized locus through those very acts. However, all such instances are within the context of conventional understanding, closely connected to a complex set of tasks frequently attributed to evolved cognitive systems. Naturally, the question becomes to which instance is one comfortable with bestowing such faculties to structures such as RNA, bringing one back to the matter of employed language. If one looks at RNA, it becomes fairly evident that whilst conceptualizing self is still far-fetched, provided the lacking internal complexity of the structure as self isn't solely a matter of regulatory behavior, but requires also a centralized locus that is involved in an entire range of complicated tasks. What RNA does through its catalytic activity is closer to the concept of self-sustainability acting upon unaccounted or undifferentiated. The question that emerges is the one pertaining to a level of sustenance, as connected through various mechanisms with the emergence of an observational level by means of keeping a structural integrity. In many ways, NASA definition acts within an all-encompassing parameters, as defining self within the prospects and complexity of human cognition is inherently impossible without a complex apparatus able to contemplate such all living entities have capacity for self-sustenance. In order to come to terms what is meant by such, and how this pertains to the investigation of origins, a deeper understanding of sustainability is needed. A search through available dictionaries online will quickly prove itself fruitful in illuminating further pathways, as to sustain is at its most rudimentary equalized with capability to uphold or maintain. Further implications ensue as to sustain is always followed by something, and as such points towards maintenance of and on a level. As such, any entity that pertains to the faculty of life must exhibit behavior that allows for such interference to occur. On the other hand, the structure that has been bestowed the faculty of line must simultaneously exhibit abilities to execute the complex set of operations required for its inclusion into the definition. How things happened is the question for quantum physics, as the complexity of such surpasses the accountancy of the presented matter, and starts dealing within contextualizing storage of memory and recognition of organisms invisible to the naked eye. It is interesting contemplating the fact that life as presented to us is more than evidently entangled with the concept of levels and sustenance from the very onset, with ensuing implications readily evident across socio-economical and geopolitical spheres. Thus, by unpacking the origin of the process and its further development, what readily emerges is its contingency on the principal faculty of self-sustainability, effectively anchored in its capacity for maintaining or having ability to maintain oneself or itself on a given level by an independent effort. Naturally, the emphasis here is placed upon several tightly connected concepts. Maintaining oneself is inexorably intertwined with a level, and both faculties are in turn intimately tied to an entity with capacity to come to terms within both instances and act on autonomous basis. Within the same mode of inference, it becomes evident that that which has developed an ability to apprehend itself as and in a state has also gained capacity to assimilate its experience with that particular state. It is a fairly peculiar matter to investigate how such occurrence could have emerged from the initial circumstances where the inanimate territorialized the entire domain of existence, and the early conditions weren't hospitable for formation of life to occur. At this point, there is no doubt that during the phase transition that follows from development of RNA towards the first unicellular organisms, the former starts exhibiting similar abilities that would later on develop towards and into the evolutionary process. By catalyzing external structures and adopting the right forms into its own self-sustenance, the molecules in question have exhibited a set of properties followed by an ensuing cascade of implications. If one attempts to conceive of how such could have occurred, one can speculate whether the push and pull exhibited on the differentiated structures by the volatile conditions have altered the equilibrium of the internal arrangement towards a form of incessant circularity, where the need to defend structural integrity emerged as its own oddity. In that manner, what was once passive/dormant/latent within the mentioned scope has, by the means of being incessantly exposed to conditions that have challenged the internal capacities, developed means of assessing conditions, and instigated its own proliferation as means of preserving itself within the apprehended or mapped domain. By observing any structure that upholds autonomy through its structural identity as defined by the bonds entailed, it becomes apparent that such will always stand on energetical steady ground with low level of reactivity with its surroundings. However, if the structural integrity has been incessantly jeopardized, one can theoreticize that all interactions that have asserted force on such would also, due to their inherent intensity, have affected the internal energetical equilibrium, and as such had posed a challenge to its structural integrity. In many ways, one can conceive of a balloon after it has been inflated and tied to maintain its shape. If one would incessantly exert force and pressure on it, one will see that the form of the balloon, its structural integrity, and subsequently its form and thus identity, would be affected to push and pull, which would undoubtedly challenge the internal state and capacity. If the balloon was made of organic matter and was exposed to such dimensions over prolonged periods of time, the question that comes forth is whether the structure in question would develop means of recognizing forces exerted on it and its subsequent adaptation to them. The challenge proposed through such circumstances could have potentially been an initial catalyst that would later on have prompted the emergence and development of Sand's apparatus, where the system started recognizing itself through the means the sensations it has been subjected to, and as such initiated mapping its own integrity. In that manner, the self that has awakened within the context of a respective structure would now become intimately tied to the level it has awakened solely by the fact that it was the first instance of such occurrence. Thus, the level of awakening becomes the initial benchmark, and the sensations that it has been exposed to become the first form of interaction with the outside. World as it is apparent to us is well defined within its vast diversity. One isn't too far out of line when asserting that the initial encounter, regardless of it being a feedback loop, is also a place where the structures would develop into organisms, and as such the qualitative differentiation within the initial environment had something to say when it comes to further diversification. How and why this pertains to RNA, and the very transition from inanimate to animate is still decently clouded. However, it becomes apparent that self-sustenance is followed by quite a complex cascade of implications that exists within circular notions alongside those that follow the arrow of time. Within such scope, language becomes important, as it naturally allows one to investigate the scope and extension of attributes that belong to the both ends of the binary inanimate/animate and phase transition alike. It is somewhat exciting to contemplate at which point the structure becomes the self. If RNA has already shown propensity for self-recognition, to which extent does the self exist within such scope? Does it need to be enveloped by a membrane in order for such to occur? Is self a fixed term solely contingent upon the manner it presents itself to human beings? Evolution is a peculiar process that on its own act as a token of incremental changes within the scope of cognition and extension. It becomes quite fascinating to ponder on which pillars how, where, and why boundaries and diversification rest. When it comes to the self as exhibited in the initial phase of emergence of life, he question becomes the one of the particular set parameters aligning in such a way as to manifest an experience during or under which the structures manage to come to terms as being the locus of sensations. In that manner, through an act of mapping thresholds, by means of accounting for experiences that it has been subjected to the structure, becomes perceptive of the reciprocal state of interaction that it is now partaking in. Within such scope, two faculties unfold from the initial notion of self-sustainability, namely self-recognition and self-accountancy. It is hard to distinguish what came first. Perhaps none, as it appears that all the acts are intimately entwined with each other, and as such act as a codependent system, while subsequently warranting each other's existence. The same goes for the parameter of sustenance, as maintenance of any kind is first and foremost a faculty reserved for subjects with capacity to map the diverse set of variables and align them within the scope of categorical order. The same goes for the following. In essence, to recognize something is assimilated with being able to acknowledge something through means of comparison by aligning parameters in such a way as to identify circumstances that connect such based on the acquired body of knowledge. In the same manner as above, this set of action requires a locus that within its respective capacity can outline and attend to matters within the organizational scope. Within that context, to account for something is readily assimilated with prospects of outlining its boundaries and determining the content that has come to define it by the set of attributed values. Whilst the accounted faculties can act within the range of synonyms, there are certain disparities within the field of overlap, each illuminating its specific sphere. Perhaps this is just yet another trick of the system, where during awakening to a state, the structure simultaneously develops an ability to discern for that very state through means of extending the complexity of the inner recognizing apparatus. However, this implies that if the system has developed the capacity to recognize, it has also developed the prospects of coming to terms with the sensations it has been subjected to. Thus, what was once purely quantitative state develops into a qualitative differentiation, where the latent structure has been exposed to conditions that have ushered parameters towards a state where recognition of the experiential capacity has prompted emergence of self as the locus of experience and the one who defines it. It is interesting to note that this dimension of recognition becomes the first step towards developing identity anchored in the increasing centralization of the experience of the self, and through such means subjectivity starts unfolding intact with the circumstances. If recognition is anchored in acknowledgement of the parameters that have influence on the structure in question, then the domain of accountancy is dominated by identification of experienced sensations. What becomes quite peculiar in and of its own is the dimension where anchoring the self within a level, implies a notion defined by qualitative differentiation of the impressions, and as such recognition of the self within the contextual level. Aside from the above-mentioned faculties that are inherently involved in the task of establishing the newly awakened structures to gain a foothold within the context of the developing self as a locus, domain of sustainability entails, yet another intriguing notion. Self becomes readily accounted for through the experiences it is having, whilst sustenance becomes the domain of recognition, where the level of maintenance becomes defined by the parameters exclusive to that level, which in turn feeds back into the subject defining such to begin with. Furthermore, the never-ending spiral manifests again under the following conditions. If self-sustenance is defined by maintenance on a level, and maintenance is in its turn defined by keeping or upholding something and implies a continuous temporality, then it is no wrong to infer that the very act of awakening to such capacity implies also an awakening to a dimension of goal-directedness. Whilst this has been mentioned a bit earlier in the text, the importance of such can't be underestimated, as already during the dawning of the process, what is being accounted for is development of qualitative differentiation on the basis of individual experience. What appears to be central to the emergence of a structure with the capacity for entering a self-sustaining loop is exactly the investigative approach to an observation of the states defined by the established exchange of information and energy that creates space for the structure to account for itself through the developing means available to it. The ensuing cascade doesn't solely pertain to the structures being exposed to sensations, but also serves as cornerstones in establishing the identity through means of a system being able to actively account for the novel experience, and through such means identify the state this happens on. It is quite fascinating being able to observe that a structure, which was once inanimate, has by undergoing phase transition unintentionally initiated self-identification through the means of coming to terms with the level it is attempting to sustain itself on. As such, the loop established and pertaining to the trifold of self-recognition, self-accountancy, and emergent goal-directedness is the one that ushers further propagation, not solely on the individual levels of existence, but is equally responsible for the entirety of the ensuing evolutionary process. If the structure has developed in such a way as to pertain to its own goal-directedness, then what is implied within such prospects is the developing capacity to qualitatively distinguish between sensations such has been exposed to. Furthermore, this very occurrence becomes a cradle of individual and subjective identity, where the capacity at which the individual structure pertains to the qualitative differentiations becomes a matter of the emerging internal calculus. The peculiarity of the process that instigates the phase change appears to lie in that exact change where the individual structure's transitions from inanimate specter towards a biomorphic calculator with its intentionality-anchored maintenance. If one is to close one's eyes and attempt to conceive of what it means to maintain something, one will perhaps notice that such pertains to a form of experience that has a clear intention and recognition of a cascade of factors that together act as a reified level, where value emerges with emphasis on that which is to be maintained. Naturally, for us complex cognizing subjects, this doesn't appear as a difficult task outside our grasp of capabilities. However, life isn't solely defined by complex organisms, and the notion of self-sustainability is equally valid for unicellular organisms as much as it is for the multicellular ones. We have the capacity to conceive of, imagine, visualize, establish, defend, and let go. In that manner, the operation complexity required for something be maintained is within the scope of our mental powers. However, when it comes to the wide variety of beings that define life, the question of the capacity of the respective entities to manage information, even under the banner of instinct notions such as storage, memory, and informational processing, become increasingly peculiar to account for. This particular notion becomes even more intriguing contextualized through the lens of the emerging meaning entailed in every one of these instances. If one looks at the universe as inanimate, one will quickly come to recognize that whilst there are some fundamental underpinnings that appear to us as governing the observable interactions, meaning doesn't seem to be an evident notion anchored in the system as a whole. From the point of view of human species, the underlying mechanisms appear as fundamental laws. However, the truth is closer to the fact that the universe simply interacts on its own premises, whilst we, as the observer that is ensnared in meaning and is simultaneously a result of cascade defined by causality, are the ones that are seeking to establish connections and relations in an attempt to account for that which we observe. As such, meaning isn't a fundamental property of the universe, and neither is the existence of laws. All the calculations, numerical and symbolic attributes, are attempts of the human mind to come to terms with represented actuality and its underlying reality. As such, the above-mentioned faculties serve as qualitative manifestation, even if to us such have quantitative attributes, that is attempting to account for the world through means of adding layers of description to it. Equations, words, and the rest of the symbols employed within the context of their explanatory capacity simply are and add a descriptive layer that highlights the relational character the universe operates on as a whole, regardless of their role within the scientific objective to come to terms with our surroundings. For many, this might pose as somewhat challenging, as the language of mathematics and physics expressed through numerology and proven equations is clearly of a deterministic non-subjective character, devoid of qualitative flutter. However, it is important to come to terms that this is simply yet another one of human attempts to come to terms with the content embedded within the scope of our cognition and cognizing. The question of emergent meaning is a fairly peculiar one, as whilst it exists as a contextualized property of the universe we inhabit, it is also highly contingent upon the observer with the capacity to arrange and impart such. The question that naturally comes forth is in accordance to what? If one observes the universe from the point of simply existing, without the need to account for itself through any means, the circumstances peculiar to the planet Earth become self-evident. The emergence of life is one of the biggest puzzles beginning for further elucidation. If the structural development that accompanies the transition can be an oddity that, regardless of minimal chances to support its occurrence, can happen within the scope of probability, the evolutionary process, its incessant proliferation and hierarchical order defined by and imbued in meaning, propose more than exciting prospects for further elucidation. If one takes into account the infinitesimal chances of life developing within the circumstances as those attributed to the early planet Earth, the oddity of the process only increases with every step of the escalation towards evolutionary complexity. Naturally, whatever it is, it doesn't stop there as the emergence of humankind as only evident species that can extrapolate meaning from the relational dimension that define the plane of existence and use such within the scope as evident today adds further layers of complexity. Within its own emergence, the faculty of life is mysterious to us, as its ignition appears to defy the capacity of the world to be accounted for in its entirety through the set of quantitative translations/definitions. In order to describe and mediate impressions, mankind has incessantly been attempting to approximate its own first-person experience and contextualize such by means of establishing levels of familiarity within the desired context. The matter of establishing a definition of what life is, it becomes evident that the encapsulated content is highly contingent upon two key parameters. One where the instance being accounted for is a manifestation of the process through means discernible by the existence of biochemical markers, and the language that governs the interpretation of the emergence. Naturally, the latter presents a challenge, as its role within the mediatory capacity is simultaneously governed by the translatory dimension, subsequent connecting the phenomenon with its fundamental underpinnings and our apprehension of such. The universe rests upon this notion, incessant approximations that transits one into another, from quantitative relationships to qualitative and vice versa, each defined by the observer who is able to contemplate such. The properties of language that link the informational processing to a set of qualitative differentiations enter into a state of interconnectedness that within the respective domain adopts a descriptive role. It is what you think it is not what you think it is. The notions become more fuzzy. Language plays a role of a king, jester, and everything in between where it exists within its illuminating scope, as much as the one that incessantly plays tricks on us. If organisms of different complexities pertain to the same terminology, perhaps what the matter at hand is rather the one of nivellations that exist in actuality, and that is yet to be rendered through the formal terminology. Is language lacking, or does it highlight something altogether more fundamental acting within the descriptive capacity as warranted by its initial emergence? If the universe exists within the scope of circularity and linearity alike, ambiguity is bound to emerge. Peculiarities of the highlighted process come forth from the ability to observe the evolution of a system through the means removed from its original physical materializations that act as anchors of the process, and as such adopt a role of markers of manifested space and time. The human eye defines that represented actuality from the point of successive linearity, where the clearly established thread points towards past and the future. The more one becomes aware of the convolution embedded in the system, the less apparent the inception becomes. Signs point one towards another and are readily exchangeable, yet the peculiarities of such pertain to the individual framework or outlook. The substitution of symbols from equation to terminology that comes about carries within itself something highly interesting, namely, that language a phenomenon unrestrained by physical form, and recognized within shared reality which has emerged in the course of development of the process through unimaginable timelines, is utilized retroactively to highlight the sequence of events responsible for its existence. There is a certain beauty in observing the means through which the process unfolds on itself, whilst simultaneously feeding back into itself. Thus, the question that emerges is not whether this particular dimension of the response loop is essential or fundamental to our existence, but to which degree the mimesis occurs and has come to sculpt the individual and the collective. In this manner, language enters into a retroactive state where its illuminative prospects go hand in hand to that of descriptiveness, as the main role is fully aligned within its mediatory capacity that accounts for states or experiences between the differentiated instances. It adopts a role where it approximates and clarifies the transfer embedded in the evolutionary process, and as such is one of the main arbiters between the subjectively perceived and approximations that come about in the shared reality, where the qualitative notions, such as perception of the color red, taste, or any similar instance of territorialization by the qualitative dimension, are aligned or anchored within yet another symbolic structure. If one is in love, one will come to express such through the means that serve the mediatory purpose, of course, at one's own will, language being one of the many with such capacity. A word or a sentence can be substituted with gesture, a gesture with a token, and a token back to the word. There is a fascinating dimension of circularity and slash or mimesis that seems to pervade the universe as a whole. As such, whilst the symbols aren't readily exchangeable between the respective fields they belong to, it is important to note that they are subjected to the course of running parallel one to another. In the grand scheme of things, regardless of the incessant convergence towards complexity, it is all a replay of the few fundamental notions that incessantly repeat themselves. mimetics appears to be embedded from the very onset. It is the question of why that lingers. The fascinating dimension occurs during the phase transition, as the purely mechanistic increasingly pertains to selfhood through the act of repetition and recognition, where both quantitative and qualitative acquire meaning within the relational context. As such, the dimension of measurement and that of qualitative descriptiveness come to close proximity one with another, as the established connection surfaces through means of doubling within the linguistic domain. If one looks at humanity, it seems that everything revolves around the relationship between the quantitative and the qualitative, and we are as society deeply immersed into all sorts of measurements. If one looks at it from the purely evolutionary perspective, the calculator aspect has always existed. However, within the scope of transcendence, this exchange starts acquiring context. These assessments are subsequently employed as correlatory means that facilitate the illumination and calibration of the relationship between the self and the anchoring level. On a human level, one is quick to recognize the most conspicuous of such relations pertains to assets that run parallel to a particular lifestyle. However, the available examples stretch much farther than this, as the human species has come to recognize that the world doesn't exist within the segregated state where the quantitative and the qualitative are reserved to their respective contents, but exist within the simultaneously descriptive relationships readily discernible through the recognition of the context. For instance, the scientific inquiry closely pertains to the means of highlighting quantitative underpinnings, which are readily discernible through the means of sheer observation. This, of course, is not the only way science is readily concerned with the established relationship, as the possibilities for discernment of factors pertaining to the matter at hand are close to endless. Every permutation of the parameters in one or the other direction contains within itself a possibility of highlighting a new part of the map or the relation that has not been encountered before. Thus, the way one approaches the apparent contingency is somewhat of a never-ending story, accounting for a ceaseless fascination. Another interesting instance, where the relationship between the quantitative and the qualitative is readily evident, pertains to the topic du jour. If one looks at development of technology, and the field of coding AI within its developmental scope emerges as a semi-sentient novelty, where the algorithms embedded at the core of the computational tasks correspond to a set of actions that have qualitative values embedded in them. One can, for example, ask a robot to bring a glass of water, to drive a car, or engage in conversation. Yet this set of behaviors is contingent upon algorithms expressed through numerical symbols translated into qualitative values. Whilst the program rests upon the inherent qualities embedded into the machine by the human hand, the manner it comes to resolution is increasingly left to machinery. In many ways, this is not too far off what sentient carbon-based beings are engaging in. The instigated course of action is that of incessant continuation, yet how one goes about such is left on the level of species and individual. If humanity didn't come to establish means of measurement by the way of employing numbers and equations, one would have been left with purely Semitic content in an attempt to discern the core of the matter. However, by having two or more sets of possibilities directed towards the same or similar goal, the potential for describing the matter as it is in its autonomous actuality advances accordingly. A state one is in, be it happy or sad, in love or not, is readily discernible through the means of matching the contents with the observed picture. The biochemical state can be expressed in many ways, and as such it can be attached to the facial expression one is wearing, to the amount of money one is spending, and to the music one is listening. The common denominator is the overlap defining the subjective state. What all of this pertains to is different means the interplay between the quantitative and the qualitative unfolds in an analogous or even mimetic manner. Perhaps. Perhaps not. It's neither nor and both at the same time.